Grief is real, big, better shared. The podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear.
I'm Kevin Lee, President and CEO of Mid-America Transplant, and we are honored to sponsor this episode of Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared. At Mid-America Transplant, we have the privilege of working with families across southern Missouri and northeast Arkansas who make the heroic decision to donate their loved ones' organs or tissues. While donation often brings families comfort, they are still heartbroken by their loss. We are driven by compassion for these families and continue to walk with them through their grief journey. Mid-America Transplant provides several programs to help families memorialize their loved one, but we believe that some of the best support can be provided by a grief center. We are proud to work with the Center for Good Grief and appreciate everything they are doing in the region to bring healing to people who are coping with loss. Mid-America Transplant is inspired by life and by the donor families who give transplant patients a second chance at life. For more information about being a donor, visit sayyesgivelife.org.
Hello, welcome to Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared, the podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear. I'm Angela Hamblin-Kelly, the administrator of the Baptist Centers for Good Grief, and we're so glad that you are tuning in today. If this is your first time checking out our podcast, please know that we have Season 1 available wherever you get your podcast. In Season 1, there's a lot of great content about grief in general, about spouse loss, men in grief, and important things to know about childhood and adolescent grief. So make sure you go back and catch up on those episodes. With Season 2, we've heard from you and we listened to you, and we're going to focus more on some specific topics in a very short format. Just as a reminder, the Baptist Centers for Good Grief has been providing grief care for over 25 years. We've grown from a children's grief camp to a program with 3 comprehensive grief centers in Tennessee and Arkansas. We started this podcast because grief is the most universal experience there is. Again, this is the podcast everyone needs to hear because grief involves pain and vulnerability, which is also why this is the podcast nobody wants to hear. So I sit here today as a grief counselor, but I'm also a griever. So in our podcast, we hope to honestly look at grief and discuss the heart and head tug of war from an evidence-based grief counseling perspective, but also the very real-life perspective as well. So today we are going to talk about how to help someone who is grieving. This is such an important topic to us at the Baptist Centers for Good Grief because we know that grief is real and big and better shared, and we want to help your support system know how to support you and care for you better. So I would encourage you to share this podcast with those who love you, those who you've identified as your support people, and maybe this is something that you all can talk about together. But in order to do this, Lauren, who is our clinical director, is here to talk with me about how we get those who are supporting us to support us well. Mm-hmm. So thank you, Lauren.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you.
So we know that death is a subject that makes people uncomfortable. It's not a subject that most people are open just to sitting down and discussing, and that can be for a variety of reasons. Sometimes we think, well, they look like they're doing okay today. I don't want to bring it up. But we know there is such a great need to express and share pain. Mm-hmm. And that we know that grief from the death of a loved one is not something that can be fixed. I feel like I say that all the time. Grievers, you are not broken. You do not need to be fixed. You need to be heard. You need to be supported. So just with that, we also know there are no magic words or there's no magic wand. So those of you that are listening, you know, we're not about to give you the perfect script to use to help people, but we are going to give you very helpful things that you can do, and that how you can help support those who are grieving, and support them and not make their grief harder. Because unfortunately, sometimes in this work, we've learned from people that they have to really work on their support system because sometimes people can say things that maybe aren't so helpful. So we'll get into that in a little bit.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think one of the most powerful things that you can do to support somebody who's grieving is just be present. And that's hard because Angela mentioned that there's not quick fixes for grief or a magic wand, but we really wish there was. I think it's our human nature to want to jump in and fix things, especially if we see somebody hurting. Our intentions are really good, right?
Absolutely.
If somebody's hurting, we want to do something to make them feel better. That's natural. Grief is a little counterintuitive in that way because that may not be what the grieving person needs. We know that grief requires space. We know that grief requires expression. And so what grieving people need is somebody to help provide that for them, to give them the space, to be a presence so that they can express their grief if they need to and if they feel comfortable doing so. I think for a lot of people that can cause them to feel helpless. They feel like being present, what does that mean? I feel like I'm not doing anything.
Right.
And so I just feel like I can't say enough how truly powerful that is. And we hear that from people, that the people that they view as their supportive people are the ones who are just there, and they don't try to change their grief, and they don't try to tell them what they need to be doing, and they don't try to jump in and change the subject and take their grief away.
Yeah, I think sometimes if I could have a billboard to help people supporting those who are grieving, I would say something like what was said to me many times when I was in school. Believe it or not, I liked to talk and got in trouble in school a lot for talking. And I had a nun who yelled at me a lot that I had one mouth and two ears for a reason, and that we are meant to listen more than we were meant to talk. Mm-hmm. And I bring humor in here because I think sometimes we have to. But if I could have a billboard to help people know how to support people who are grieving, I would say, close your mouth mm-hmm. and open your ears and listen.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times what we'll hear too from people who are worried about somebody who's grieving or who are in the role of being a supportive person and they feel completely lost is sort of, well, what do I do after I listen?
Right.
you know, okay, I'm here, I'm listening. Now what?
Right.
And I think it's okay to not say anything at all. Mm-hmm. I think it's okay. It may feel a little odd. Mm-hmm. Again, this is not what we're accustomed to doing, but it's okay to just be a presence. Or if you want to say something, it's okay to just let them know, I'm so glad you told me that. You don't have to have a response to what they're saying. You're just letting them know that you're there.
And I sometimes am a really direct person. I know that's surprising too, but I think sometimes for people, if you're listening, and like you said, Lauren, I love that because people do, okay, well, I listened, but now what? Mm-hmm. Is maybe to say, I don't know what to say or do, mm-hmm. but I am willing to show up and figure it out with you. Mm-hmm. Because oftentimes the griever doesn't know what they need either.
Right.
And so sometimes I think that's a great way of breaking the ice is by just simply acknowledging, I don't really know what to say or do, mm-hmm. but I care about you and I love you and I'm not afraid of you. Mm-hmm. And so if you're willing to give me some direction, I will mm-hmm. do it.
Yes.
And so sometimes I've heard a lot of clients really feel so supported by that, because they know that there's nothing that you can do for them. Mm-hmm. So sometimes that can help start a conversation of, yeah, could you just sit here and mm-hmm. could you just be in the house while I take a nap?
Right.
You know.
Right. Yeah, I think that's such a good point that you brought up, that a lot of times grieving people don't know what they need. Mm-hmm. So when we, maybe make a sort of a general statement like, just let me know if you need anything. Mm-hmm. Again, that's such a sweet thing to say. We're not saying that it's not, but you may not hear what they need from you because they may not know it, or, it may not be, when they do think of it, it may not be in a way that they can ask you, or a time when they can ask you. So I really like what you said, Angela, about, just checking in with them about, what they need, but not just in a general way. Mm-hmm. For example, you could say, I would love to do this for you. Would that be helpful? Mm-hmm. Because again, everybody grieves differently. So what might be helpful for one person may or may not be helpful for somebody else. One person might really love for you to come over and fold their laundry for them. and that would help them, feel like they got a task done. And somebody else may really not want that. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important to check in with people, offer suggestions about ways that you can help, and see if that's something that they would like from you.
Right. I had a client who talked about someone who just showed up with toilet paper and paper towels. Mm-hmm. And she was like, that was amazing. Mm-hmm. And I'm not kidding. She probably talked about that person out of all of her support people the most. And it was because I didn't have to think about it. I didn't know if I was out of toilet paper, mm-hmm. but nobody wants to be out of toilet paper. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes it is like kind of these very concrete things. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes it is the people who can sit and listen. Mm-hmm. And I think too, just remembering about support, especially if you're a support person, you don't have to be all of the support for mm-hmm. a person. Yeah. People can't find their support in one place. Mm-hmm. They didn't before their loved one died. And so, there are various roles for different people. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important, especially if you're listening as a support person.
Right. Yeah. And, it may be that you are somebody who you feel more comfortable offering support in some of those practical mm-hmm. ways. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with that. It's, as Angela said, it's really about finding your way that you can be of support to somebody else. And if you are somebody who's grieving, that might be a way to think about your support system. What are the different ways that the people in your life are able to offer you support, and how can you communicate that to them?
And support looks different in the first hours, days, weeks, mm-hmm. And into the months and into the years, mm-hmm. because, grief is more than 12 months. People are going to grieve beyond that first year. Mm-hmm. They're still going to have needs of support. They're going to be different. They're going to look different. Mm-hmm. But kind of knowing that and remembering that just because it's been 6 months and they look like they're doing well, they still need support. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes too, remembering special dates, mm-hmm. remembering, Mother's Day is coming up, or the holidays, mm-hmm. or, maybe keeping a mental note of when their wedding anniversary, mm-hmm. and being supportive on those very special, significant days as well. So grief needs change. Grief support needs change mm-hmm. over time. And so conversations need to change mm-hmm. too, like, well, what are you needing? I had a client who had somebody who was bringing meals, lots. And then all of a sudden it was like, if one more person brings me a meal, I'm going to lose my mind. Mm-hmm. And I remember saying to her, well, have you told them that? She's like, no, I haven't. I probably should tell them that, and that here's another way that would be helpful to us. And so I think that's something too, is that we have to remember is that those needs, they do change.
Right. And it's a long process mm-hmm. as well. So a lot of times what we'll see is that there's a lot of support right in the beginning.
Yes.
And then, people start going back to their lives and getting back to their normal routines. And it's not so much in the forefront of their mind. But for the person who's grieving, it still affects every aspect of their world. And they still do need people to let them know that they're there for them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's talk about some practical things to help a person who is grieving, because we know folks who are listening, they want to know kind of what are those practical things. And the first one, I'm going to say it again, but we've already talked about it, is being present. You can just not give enough credit to being present. I feel the need to say that most people will say things like, they don't remember what people said to them in those first days and weeks, but they remember who was there with them. They remember who showed up. And that is, you just cannot give enough credit to being present.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, I think we mentioned this before, but it's okay for there to be silence. Mm-hmm. It's okay to just have that quiet space, because sometimes that's what the grieving person is needing, just to process or just to feel and not have to put something into words in that moment. And they don't need that space, filled with noise either. It's okay not to say anything.
Right. Oh, goodness. I think it's really important to kind of put in your head as best you can, because these things just come out of our mouths sometimes, but avoiding cliches.
Yes.
They are usually well-intended, but they also usually sting. So we've talked about this in some other podcasts, but just this phrase that, something good can come from this. While that may be true at some point in the processing, it does not feel that way in those first few days, weeks, months, years maybe, that, well, great, something good can come from someone else. Why did it have to come from my person? Or why did this have to happen to our family for something good to come?
Right. What I think that implies is that there's a reason
Yes.
somebody died. And while, yes, we do see times where good things can come after loss, I think it's very important to separate that from saying that it's a reason why somebody died.
I think another thing I would put in this category is messages we give, maybe to children like boys don't cry, or you need to be strong, or even to adults like, gosh, you just look like you're doing so good. You're so strong. I mean, I just think those messages in general, we need to think about. And here's the thing. These things come out of our mouths, and it's going to happen to you as a supporter to a griever because you care about them and you love them and you want to help.
Yeah.
Just what I would challenge you to do is just be mindful of those words, mindful of those cliches. That again goes back to what we were saying. The best two gifts you can give is being a little quiet and being a little present.
Yes, absolutely. I think a lot of times we'll hear phrases that have a spiritual nature in this category. Things like they're in a better place.
Yes.
Or, we may hear people say, God needed another angel. And again, those come from a good place. The person who's saying that is drawing on faith in an attempt to comfort the grieving person. That's understandable. We just want to be careful with that. Because for the person who's grieving, that, again, may not be a consolation, because, well, okay, I'm glad they're in a better place, but I still wish they were here now with me.
Yeah. I want to still be able to see, touch, and feel them and live life with them. And yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think another important thing, if you're supporting a grieving person, is say the name of the loved one who died. Say their name.
Yes.
Say their name in the first few days, weeks. Say it in the years. Don't be afraid to say it. And I've heard some really great people who support grieving folks say, I just didn't know if it was okay, because, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, they look like they were doing well. That person's name is always on their mind. It's always in their heart. And it really does people so much more good to hear their loved one's name than to not hear it.
Yes. Think about just the significance of a name and just how powerful that is and how much we associate with somebody's name. And so just even something as simple as that, just being able to hear it, can be so meaningful.
I think from our clients, that's probably the one tip that they would want people to know the most, is to not stop talking about the person and not stop saying their name.
Right.
Yeah.
I think another phrase that we hear sometimes that we want to be careful with is, I know how you feel. I can tell you, I can tell you that's something we hear from our clients so often, is how hard that is when they hear that from somebody else. And usually it makes them pretty angry because everyone's grief is different. First of all, you cannot understand how somebody else is feeling unless you've been in that situation. And then on top of that, even if you have been in that situation, even if you have maybe experienced a similar loss to the person who is currently grieving, there are so many factors that make each loss experience unique that you still can't know how they're feeling. And so we really want to be careful with that. I think it's okay to say, I can't know exactly how you're feeling, but I'm willing to listen and I'm willing to try to learn.
And I can share with you, especially if we have a common loss. I mean, there is something about grief being shared, but sort of waiting for that invitation for it to be shared, not immediately turning it around to your situation, because again, then they're not feeling heard.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think an important thing to do is to learn about grief. The fact that you're tuning into a podcast like this and learning, that just says so much about how much you care and you love and you want to know, and you don't want to, you want to help and not do more harm. And so learning about grief, what are the ways that we grieve? Again, just because there's so many misconceptions, there's so many myths of grief out there. We all come with our own history of grief and maybe what we've learned from our families. And it's important to know what grief really is. How does grief really show up? And what are ways that are really healthy to help people grieve and mourn?
I think another thing to be mindful of is just really being prepared to respond if they do ask for help. I can tell you that often we hear from the people we work with that they don't want to be a burden to people, that it's hard to ask for help. I think a lot of times we are rewarded for self-sufficiency, and that's sort of ingrained in our culture. And it's hard to ask for help. It's a very vulnerable thing. And so if somebody who's grieving has done that, they've worked up that courage to ask for help, be prepared to follow through on your offer for help, or, be prepared to follow through with what they are needing and listen to what their needs are, what they're asking for.
And I think if you're in a family that's grieving, you're all grieving the same person. Everyone is having these grief reactions. But I think it's important to remember that even within a family, we grieve so differently. And so our needs aren't going to be the same. And really listening to each other is so important. And I think too, just if you're supporting a grieving person, is showing up with compassion. Grief is not pretty. It is so messy. And these normal, common ways we grieve, we talk about, they can change so fast and without warning. And they can be startling, and sometimes they can be offensive and rude because grief is messy. Now, I'm not saying that means you have to be put up with being treated poorly, not saying that at all, but I think sometimes bringing grace to the situation and grace to the table and understanding that there's just so much going on, all of these common grief reactions, and they change so quickly that oftentimes grievers are just not at their best, and bringing some compassion to them.
You mentioned grieving as a family, and I think that's something very much to keep in mind if you are supporting grieving children or teenagers, because you may see some of that in their behaviors. And again, as Angela said, we're not implying that you let kids get away with problematic behaviors, but you approach it in a gentle and compassionate way, and take into consideration that this is grief.
Yeah. One thing we say sometimes to families, especially with children, is that we don't believe in handing out crutches because this has happened. That we have to learn healthy ways of coping, and we can't, a lot of times people will be afraid that especially children are going to use this as a crutch to get through or to get away with something. And that's not what we're saying. But we're saying that grief needs time, and it needs support, and it needs love, and it needs grace and compassion in various ways sometimes. And for a while.
Right.
Yeah.
You mentioned healthy coping skills, that's sort of the goal, is for grieving people to develop healthy coping skills. I think it can be very tempting sometimes when we are supporting somebody who's grieving to try to tell them what those coping skills need to be. So I think another suggestion that I would offer for you is to be mindful of and to try to avoid the advice giving. If you're starting a sentence with "you should" or "you need to," maybe stop, rethink that sentence. It's fine to offer suggestions. Absolutely, that's fine. just be careful in how you do it. You don't want to come across as trying to, again, tell them the fix for their grief.
Right. And especially that sometimes can look a little messy as well if I'm also a griever and I know what worked for me and I care about you and love you and I want you to do this so that you'll feel better. And that can get messy when it's kind of grief, maybe even in a family, we're all grieving. But again, I think that's so wise if that starts to come out of your mouth to stop and maybe say, okay, for me, this was helpful. And then I like to say things like, I wonder what you might think might be helpful, and we have to remember that we're all unique individuals and that our grief is not the same.
Right.
So for the grievers out there, if you're listening to this as well, and hopefully you're finding some things that you would like to share with your support, just a couple of words about that, about how you can help your support people support you. And how you can share those feelings with them. And so I think one is knowing when and how to ask for help, allowing people to help you, allowing people to support you, knowing that that's actually a need you have right now as a grieving person. It does not mean that you are not strong or that you cannot take care of yourself. It means I'm grieving and I need some support. And so being willing to ask for that. I think also, griever, just like we ask the people who are supporting you to show up with compassion, if you can show up with some grace for yourself.
Yes.
Because you're not always going to be your best. And that might feel then embarrassing. You may be angry at yourself. It can start a whole avalanche of emotions. And so to extend that grace to yourself as well.
Yes.
Well, Lauren, thank you for talking with me today and helping those who are supporting grievers just learn a little bit more about what they can do. Obviously, this was not an exhausted list, but just a place to get people started. And I think if you remember that you're coming from a place of love and care, that's going to be the best place. And then maybe use some of these other tips to help kind of fine tune just kind of those human characteristics that we all have. So thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
Grief does heal. Let me say that again. Grief does heal. But like we've said, grief demands attention and care. It also needs support and patience. Remember that your grief is a reflection of your love. You are not alone. The world is full of many grievers like you. You can learn more about us at www.baptistgriefcenters.org. You can check out our YouTube channel, Baptist Centers for Good Grief. You can check out our podcast wherever you get your podcast. Also, know that you can reach out and let us know if there's a topic that you're interested in learning more about. You're welcome to email me at angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. That's angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. And remember, grief is real, big, better shared. We'll talk soon.